So I'm raising a 9-year-old son, and I have to have conversations with him on how he shows up in society. What happens if he's pulled over? What happens if he is at the grocery store and a cop approaches him? How is he supposed to act?
Irene, so good to have you on Winning Wednesday. I love having V-Teamers on the show, so thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invite. I'm super excited.
Awesome. And I love to open these up with a personal professional check-in, so it kind of gives you a chance to share something that the audience might not know about you. So however you want to take that.
They might not know. I'm super open book, like it's all over my Instagram, but I am a dog mom. I'm a mom of a little human, originally from Colorado, and I snowboard.
And snowboarding is tricky. I learned how to downhill ski, and that's always said that it's much easier to learn that, but it's more fun to learn how to snowboard. So good for you for challenging yourself.
Yeah, everyone said that skiing would be so much easier than snowboarding, but I was like, no, I got to be locked in. If my legs can do what they want to do, it's a wrap.
Well, I'll have to give it a shot. I wanted to do that this season and I never got around to it, but that would definitely be a challenge. Obviously, it's Pride Month, so happy Pride. And I'm so glad that you're here to talk about Pride. Love your shirt. If you want to comment on any of that, I just think the rainbows are so good. Do you even know where kind of the rainbow came from and why that's a symbol for the LGBTQ plus community?
Each of the colors represent something that has to do, like green with the earth. Obviously it's progressed. Now we have one that has like the black and brown stripe for marginalized groups, and then also the blue and pink and white for transgender. So kind of being that all inclusive of saying, hey, yes, we started with this rainbow that's real, like super basic, but we continue to progress as our community continues to progress, for sure.
Wonderful. Yeah. And thanks for touching on those added colors, because that's part of that modern flag now. I think if anyone's seen the triangle on the side and then the regular bars with the rainbow, people might not know what's going on there because there's a lot going on. So
Sure.
That was a good breakdown. And as far as, working for Verizon and having an employer that cares about these elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion and being part of employee resource groups at Verizon, what does that look like to you and why is that so important?
So I think for me, the biggest thing is understanding that I spend a lot of time at work. I spend more time with my work family than I do my real family. I think my 9-year-old knows more Verizon terms than almost anybody these days. So being able to show up in that space authentically. When I first started with the company, it was very much of like, you can't show off tattoos, like you've got to do all of these things. You have to be more professional than anyone else in the room, being a Black woman. When I learned about ERGs and employee resource groups and what that really means and how there's tools and resources, it really kind of like shed this like newfound like aha moment for me to know that, hey, I don't have to come to work and almost live a double life, but knowing that because I show up authentically, it definitely challenges the status quo. But it also allows me to bring a different perspective and have diversity of thought, which I think Verizon does a phenomenal job of understanding why that's important, not only for V-Teamers, but also for our customers as well. Like obviously with any job, it's super demanding and can be a challenge at times, but knowing that I don't have to work so hard to hide who I am authentically makes a huge difference on how I show up at work, how I interact with other people, and then just driving my career forward.
And you mentioned professionalism, and I think even that term is kind of archaic, the way that it was historically used, and what it means today is so different, especially when we think about a remote environment where my boss is on with his kids or whatever. Like we're constantly having these blurred lines. And if you are mentally and cognitively trying to hide half of or yourself, for 8 hours, 9 hours out of the day, that can really take away from you even being able to perform to the best of your ability at your job in those moments. So how are you seeing even the professionalism component shifting in this day and age now?
I think COVID has definitely opened up a lot of different eyes, like you had mentioned. So now seeing that we're putting more of like a human aspect into our jobs makes for just a better work environment, but also makes for just better connections, because as human beings, like that's what's important to us, is that human connection.
If we've all gotten very comfortable in our home lives of showing up as ourselves, wearing what we want, Can we continue wearing what we want when we go to the office? We have high level executive leadership that wear jeans and t-shirts and pride colors and things like that. And then there's a lot of middle management that might not fall in that same category, but that might be the people that influence our day-to-day more closely. And we need to impress them. We need to work with them, and we need to show up in a way that they may accept us or something like that. So do you see things changing prescriptively where a company will tell their employees, hey, you can wear whatever you want going forward? Or will it kind of just be people pushing boundaries and showing up and asking for forgiveness later?
I think probably the latter, showing up and asking for forgiveness. Redefining what professionalism is going to be a huge component that we really have to kind of spend some time on and understanding, because what I see as professional may not be the same as someone older than me, someone younger than me, and having some of these kind of conversations allows us to kind of break down some of those barriers.
Definitely. And that's something that I really took away from 2020, especially the Black Lives Matter movement from 2020. Not to be confused with a specific organization. I know there's like some hostility there, but for me at this point, BLM is like the Band-Aid and Kleenex of things. It's just like the label that goes with it, and we know what we're talking about. It is those unconscious biases, but it's like whatever's in our head, those like lenses that we see life through, unless we talk about them as the elephant in the room that they are or were in the past, we just don't even know. And there's so many of my, Black friends and Black colleagues who I didn't even know were struggling with these things on a daily basis.
I remember very distinctly having a conversation with one of my leaders, and we started talking about the talk. Right? So I'm raising a 9-year-old son, and I have to have conversations with him on how he shows up in society. What happens if he's pulled over? What happens if he is at the grocery store and a cop approaches him? How is he supposed to act? But that's something that plays in the back of my head and doesn't really allow me to always necessarily focus, especially when it comes to right after school. So I know that like, hey, he's going from school to home. Now all of a sudden I feel that anxious like thought in the pit of my stomach, and breaking that down to my leader, he was kind of like, I never would have even imagined. I realized and noticed, and I was super grateful, because then even with not traveling, he made more of a conscious decision to say, hey, how's your son? Hey, what did you guys do this weekend? Or just kind of trying to break that down to show like, hey, I want to connect with you, made a huge difference on how I showed up for him, how I showed up for Verizon.
That's amazing. And thank you for sharing that. I know that was completely off script, but I never would have known that that was your reality if you didn't vocalize it. And growing up where I grew up, Northern New Jersey, is very predominantly kind of wealthy white neighborhood for the most part. But in terms of like what our conversations were like at home, it very much had to do with keeping up appearances more than anything. So it was how to show up in the world, how to be professional, how to do your best, things like that. It was never the realistic conversations that you guys are having, how to survive, how to avoid conflict. It wasn't stuff like that at all. And so to not even be mindful of that for a significant portion of our lives is very detrimental to the expectations that we have of other people. What does intersectionality mean, and how is it relevant to pride? We hear so often keeping these conversations away from children, and yet you're saying your son is 9 years old and you're talking about it already. So how do you find that balance of talking about these things, and what does the intersectionality look like for adults in their work environments?
I will say it's always trying to find that balance and knowing that kids will be kids. And I can only control so much, which is really nothing as a parent. But knowing that if he hears these conversations from me first, and then he goes out to school or what have you, and he's talking to kids his age and he hears something completely different, it opens the door and it creates this open communication that he can be like, hey mom, you told me this, but this is what I heard. And then we can kind of really have that conversation. So when I look at it from like adult aspect, is the intersectionality of what I'm going through may not necessarily be somebody else's, but we probably have something in common that we didn't even realize it. By sharing what it is that we're going through, I think creates that intersectionality. But I think about last year for June, right? I'm showing up ready like for Pride, knowing like where Pride came from, educating people on the history of Pride. And then it's like, hey, well, you gotta be Black right now. Well, it's not interchanging. Like I don't get to show up on Monday and be like, okay, I'm Black. On Tuesday, I'm a woman. And then on Wednesday, I'm a lesbian. Like this is kind of my labels for intersectionality and how I show up for different communities and what that really looks like. And knowing that it isn't, hey, my gayness outweighs my blackness, or my womanhood outweighs my gayness, or what have you. That intersectionality is what allows us to understand, even if we don't get it or we don't really agree, we have a certain level of respect or understanding that, hey, you may not look like me, but we may have a very similar experience because of this commonality that we didn't even realize that we had.
As you were describing your labels, for instance, I'm just thinking about the fact that I definitely have historically prioritized my woman label. For the most part, you can take a lot of pride in being feminist. Of course, people will have their own opinions on that, but that, at least for me, has always been like attributed and associated with female empowerment and like my whole career path and my ability to show up in a work environment and do my job effectively. And now that I'm going through this journey of finding my label within the LGBTQ plus community, I become very hesitant. I become like not sure of myself anymore. And that's very uncomfortable for me, especially when I think about a work environment, because I've always shown up in my professional development for myself with this growth mindset, and I just make it happen. But my personal life has not had that same care or attention. And so I just loved that you called that out. You're like, listen, none of those labels are more important than the other, and they can't really be, or shouldn't even be, separated, you know, days of the week like that. That was a good point.
Why do I need someone to fit me in this box, so to speak, to say, okay, yes, I can relate to this, or no, I can't relate to that? Sometimes, and this is just my opinion, that we have labels to almost make other people feel comfortable to be able to do that, versus just showing up and saying, yes, I am a human being.
You've been in the community for a while and at least like have found a way to accept yourself throughout. So what does Pride Month mean to you in that perspective? And then how can we all show up better as allies during this time?
Knowing that the history behind it is what really matters, and knowing that, hey, we have pride because there are basic human rights that are just not being offered to every human being. And knowing that, yes, you get to kind of like let your hair down a little bit for the month of June. And yes, it may kickstart or spark some different conversations or some different partnerships that allows you to continue that work throughout the year. But I definitely use the month of June to reflect on where we've come from, where we're going, and then what that looks like for our youth. I think I've talked about my son 100 times already just in this short amount of time. But when I think about when he is 13, when he's 15, when he's figuring out who he is as an individual, I want him to have that space, and I want him to have that space at home as well as out in the world. I waited until later in life to be like, okay, I'm gonna live my truth. I feel like it's super important for our youth to be able to show up that way now, because that's what's actually going to change the world. That's actually where we're going to see that growth. And then if I think about allyship, I think it's changing it from being an ally to being an advocate. Knowing that, hey, even if you don't approve of my lifestyle, at the core of who I am as an individual is I'm a human being. And if you can respect that and you can show value in my life as a human being, that's the part that I'm asking from an ally or from an advocate to say, hey, I don't know your struggles. Hey, I don't know what you've been through, but the human connection is really where the advocacy and the allyship work really kind of transforms how we move in the world.
You can be in or out of the community and still give people the time of day and that attention. And I think so often we focus so much on how other people should be showing up for us and how we can demand and claim respect in the world and all these other things without turning it and being like, okay, but what can I do to show up better for other people? We can just learn how to be better and give people more allowances if they're not perfect or not giving us everything that we're looking for in return.
Just as myself, as a member of the community, if someone says something that's disrespectful, or if they say something that is an outdated term or could be offensive, versus like jumping down their throat and completely blocking the door off and like boarding it up, and then they never get any kind of like education of why it could be offensive or what they even did wrong, because a lot of times people don't have ill intent. It's just, hey, this is what I heard growing up. This is where I grew up in. So this is kind of what people said, to kind of show up with that compassion and understanding of like, hey, this is a great teaching moment. This is a great teaching opportunity to say, this is why it's offensive. And even if you don't agree with it, but now you at least have the education, and then you get to make that choice to say, okay, great, I'm going to use better words, or I'm going to use better terms, or hey, I've got to show up a little bit differently because I never know if I'm going to work with someone, or if my child or a family member or anyone is going to come out to me in any way, shape, or form, that I can be that support for other individuals as well.
Maintaining our own peace and our own headspace is really what's most important at the end of the day. And I have to ask you, your favorite way to win Wednesdays?
Unapologetically authentic is how I win Wednesday and every other day, knowing that I can sit in my truth, and some people are going to love it, some people are going to hate it, some people are not going to understand it. But at the end of the day, I have that peace, like you said, with who I am, the work that I'm doing, and the passion behind that, and knowing that we're building a better world for my son and all the other little sweet little humans in the world.